أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، ثم الصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على صلى الله عليه وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. صلى الله عليك يا رسول الله، صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله. غريب يا مظلوم كربلاء، ما خاب من تمسك بكم وأمن من لجأ إليكم. يا ليتنا فيا ليتنا كنا معكم سيدي، فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. قال تعالى في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل ما يعبأ بكم ربي لولا دعاؤكم. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Respected scholars, elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to begin, before I actually begin the lecture, I'd like to express my gratitude to the community for their gracious invitation, for their hospitality, for their warmth. I feel really embarrassed to sit on the pulpit, especially when you have a community of so many learned people, a community of ulama. So I'm very humbled by this opportunity to have some discussions that I think can bring us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and closer to the path of Ahlul Bayt. So for the prosperity and the success of this community, please recite a loud salawat. One of the honorific titles of the fourth Imam of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam is Zainul Abidin. Of course, all of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam excelled in worship. But there is no doubt that Imam Al-Sajjad alayhi salam, his ibadah stands out. It's more pronounced. Now, what do we mean by this when we say that Ali ibn al-Husayn alayhi salam is Zainul Abidin? Because Zain means the adornment. And it's as though if you have a group of people who are worshippers, they all are beautiful. They all have adornment by virtue of their ibadah. But among them, there is one who stands out. And that is Ali ibn al-Husayn. Now I want to begin tonight's lecture by sharing a beautiful narration that we have in Kitabul Kafi. Shaykh al-Kulayni, Qaddasallahu nafsa, he mentions a narration. And the narration is a sahih narration from the perspective of its sanad. It's a strong narration in terms of the chain of transmission. And the narration is from Imam Sadiq. And Imam Sadiq alayhi salam gives us some insight into the incredible worship of the fourth Imam. The narration says, عن أبي عبد الله عليه السلام قال كان علي بن الحسين إذا أخذ كتاب علي فنظر إليه قال من يطيق هذا. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, just like his forefathers, his father Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, they inherited a book. And one of the books that they inherited is a book known as Kitabu Ali, the book of Ali. And this is the book of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Now, what is this book? It seems that this book is a collection of writings of Amir al-Mu'mineen penned by Ali ibn Abi Talib based on the dictations of the Prophet. So the Prophet ﷺ gave Amir al-Mu'mineen instructions on ibadah, instructions in terms of ritual worship. So this book, at least a part of it, speaks about the spiritual, the daily regimen of Ali ibn Abi Talib in terms of his ibadah, what he used to do in his daily life in terms of worship and supplication. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, he has this book, and he would read and he would use the book of Ali, his grandfather, the book of Amir al-Mu'mineen, as a guide for himself, for his own spiritual regimen. Imam al-Sadiq says that when Imam al-Sajjad would read, when he would open up the book of Ali, and he would read what we would call the a'mal that Amir al-Mu'mineen used to perform, Imam al-Sajjad, he would say, and he would speak to himself and says, "Man yutiqu hadha?" Who has the capacity to worship like this? The narration continues, and here Imam al-Sadiq, again, he's speaking, he's narrating. قال ثم يعمل به. Imam Zainul Abidin would follow the devotional practices of Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen. وكان إذا قام إلى الصلاة تغير لونه. Imam al-Sajjad, when he would stand for prayer, his face would change color. It's very easy to read this and just move on. But do you know how much you have to feel the presence of God for the color of your face to change? Imagine the presence of heart that is with Imam Zain al-Abidin. And then the narration says, حَتَّى يُعْرَفُ ذَلِكَ فِي وَجْهِهِ. It was so noticeable that when you look at Imam al-Sajjad, when he stands in salah, he looks different from when he's speaking to a person. There is a physiological change that happens in him. And then Imam al-Sadiq, he ends the hadith with a comment. And this, the end of the hadith, wallah, it gives me goosebumps when I read it. Imam al-Sadiq, he ends by saying what? وَمَا, and by the way, as I said, this is a sahih tradition found in Al-Kafi. He says, وَمَا أَطَاقَ أَحَدٌ عَمَلَ عَلِيٍّ مِّن وُلْدِهِ مِّن بَعْدِ إِلَّا عَلِيِّ ibn al-Husayn. Imam al-Sadiq is saying here something that is mind-boggling. He says, and there is no one from the progeny of Ali who was able to worship at the quantity of Ali's worship other than Imam al-Sajjad. Imam al-Sadiq is saying, in terms of quantity of worship, no other Imam was able to rival the quantity of Ali ibn Abi Talib's worship other than Imam al-Sajjad. Meaning, if you take all of the Imams, of course their ibadah is on a level that we cannot imagine. But among them, the circumstances of Ali ibn al-Husayn's life were such that he pushed himself so much that he was the only Imam who came close to the quantitative ibadah of Ali ibn Abi Talib. And this is why among the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, it's Ali ibn al-Husayn who is Zainul Abidin. Now, as I mentioned last night, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, he's the Imam after Imam al-Husayn. his duty, his responsibility before God is to continue guiding the ummah and to continue the mission of Imam al-Hussein, which is طلب الإصلاح في أمة جدي. Now, Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam, as I said last night, after Karbala, he has 3 to 5 Sahaba, 3 to 5 Shia who are Shia in the theological sense. One of the 5 or one of the 3 was a student of Imam Al-Sajjad by the name of Abu Khalid Al-Kabuli, who hails from modern day Afghanistan. He was a student of Imam Sajjad. Now, why am I mentioning this? The most narrations that we have from any Imam is from Imam Sadiq. Who is the top student of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq in terms of fiqh? Zurara ibn A'yan. Imam al-Sadiq says, if it wasn't for Zurara and the likes of Zurara, the ahadith of Muhammad al-Baqir would have been lost. This is Zurara ibn A'yan. Zurara ibn A'yan originally was not Shia. He became Shia because of his sister. And his sister has a very, amazing name. Her name is Usud, which literally means the mother of lions. So if you have a daughter, maybe it's good to name her the mother of lions. Usud al-Shaybani. She was also non-Shia at a time. She was the one who actually influenced her brothers to become Shia. Usud al-Shaybani. And she became Shia because of Abu Khalid al-Kabuli, the student of Imam Sajjad. So if you take Zurara ibn A'yan, the elite, the top student of Ja'far al-Sadiq, and many of our ahkam have come to us from Zurara. He becomes Shia because of his sister, who became Shia because of Abu Khalid al-Kabuli, and Abu Khalid al-Kabuli is a product of the tarbiyah of Imam Zayn al-Abidin. The impact of Imam Sajjad is incredible. 3 to 5 companions. By the end of his life, as I said, Shaykh al-Tusi says, he had 173 students and scholars of the highest eminence. When Imam Sajjad alayhi salam goes back to Medina, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam finds himself in a predicament. Because he is the son of the man who revolted against the Umayyads, naturally he is not given a pulpit. He is banned from delivering public sermons. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam also does not have enough supporters to wage a military conflict against the Umayyads. So he cannot militarily fight the Umayyads. He does not have a platform to disseminate the pure sunnah of the Prophet. Now, many of us, if we were in the position of Imam Sajjad, we would have had a defeatist mentality. That's it, we're helpless. One of the most important lessons that we learn from the seerah of Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam is to not have a defeatist mentality. Is to be creative. It's to adapt. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, he sees that there's no mimbar for me. I do not have any army. So what does Imam Sajjad do? He starts a process of reformation. But he does it in a way that is very subtle, and he does it in a way that is seemingly very benign, and in a way that does not alarm the Umayyads. Imagine the genius of Imam Zayn al-Abidin. You have to rebuild a community while you are being surveillanced. And you have to do it in a way that is not perceived as a security threat by Bani Umayyah. How do you do this? Imam Zayn al-Abidin, he very wisely employs dua to communicate the core teachings of Islam. Bani Umayyah can prevent me from giving a khutbah, but they can't prevent me from making dua. And Imam Sajjad saw that there were some figures in Medina, for example, the son of Umar ibn al-Khattab, Abdullah ibn Umar, after Karbala, he was very reclusive. He was known to be an abid. So Imam Sajjad is not doing anything that is unusual. He's doing the same thing as other individuals in Medina. And he's also doing what else? He's purchasing slaves. That's not something that's alarming because this was a slavery-based society. It was common for people to purchase slaves. So everything that Imam Sajjad alayhi salam was doing seemed to be very normal. The Imam, to them, from the perspective of the Umayyads, he's just sad and he's reading dua and he's supplicating and he's purchasing some slaves just like every other ordinary citizen of Medina. But they didn't realize that under their nose, Imam Sajjad was leading a revolution. This is what I mean by working quietly and not attracting unwanted attention from the zalimeen. So what does he do? Now we often speak about how Imam was able to reform the ummah through dua. What I want to do tonight is I want to give you specific examples of how the Imam used dua to guide the masses. Specific examples. And we want to look at some of the dominant themes that we find in the supplications of Imam Ali ibn al-Husayn, salawatullahi alayhi. One of the problems that Imam Sajjad saw during his time is that people were developing misunderstandings about the nature of God. You see, when you move away from the teachings of Ahlul Bayt and you don't have the guidance of the likes of Ali and Hassan and Hussein, when you go to the Quran, there are some ayats in the Quran that seemingly attribute human qualities to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yadullah fawqa aydihim, right? Ayat that speak about kullu man alayha fan wa yabqa wajhu rabbika dhil jalali wal ikram. You have verses in the Quran that speak about the face of God, the hand of God. So what was happening during the time of Imam Sajjad is that Muslims were falling into tashbih. They were likening God to His creation. Now Imam Zainul Abidin can't come and sit on the minbar and give everyone a dars on aqa'id. He knows that the Umayyads would be alarmed by this. There's a narration that says one day Imam Sajjad was walking near the grave of the Prophet and he heard some Muslims speaking about the nature of Allah. They were speaking about Allah in a way where they were attributing human qualities to God. They were anthropomorphizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the narration says that when Imam heard them likening Allah to His creation, he goes and he stands near the grave of the Prophet and he recites this dua out loud for them to hear. They think he's just reciting dua between him and Allah, but he wants to communicate an important principle of tawheed, and that is laysa kamithlihi shay'. So what does he say? He stands and out loud he recites the following dua. Ilahi badat qudratuk. O Allah, your power is apparent. We can see your power. وَلَمْ تَبْدُ هَيْئَتُكَ. But what is not apparent is your form. These individuals were speaking about Allah in a way that they were assuming that Allah can be seen. For example, in the Akhirah, as an example. So Imam Sajjad in this dua, what does he say? Oh Allah, what is apparent is your qudra, but what is concealed is your form. What is unapparent is your form. فَجَهَلُوكَ بِالتَّقْدِيرِ. Those who are ignorant of you, they set limits upon you. فَجَهَلُوكَ بِالتَّقْدِيرِ عَلَى غَيْرِ مَا بِهِ أَنْتِ. And then he says, شَبَّهُوكَ. O Allah, some of your servants liken you to your creation. وَأَنَا بَرِيءٌ يَا إِلَهِي مِنَ الَّذِينَ بِالتَّشْبِيهِ طَلَبُوكَ. O Allah, there are some among your servants who liken you to your creation. O my Lord, I disassociate from those things that they liken you to. And then he says, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِكَ شَيْءٍ. O Allah, there is nothing that is like you. وَلَمْ يَدْرِكُوكَ. But the problem is, they have not comprehended who you are. And that is why they liken you to your creation. In this dua, Imam Zainul Abidin is giving them a theological lesson. He's bringing them back to the tawheed of the Quran, the monotheism of the Quran, the Quranic conception of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he says, وَظَاهِرُ مَا بِهِمْ مِنْ نِعْمَةٍ. If they want evidence that you exist, they don't need to see your form. But rather, if they reflect on what is apparent with respect to the favors that you have conferred upon them, وَظَاهِرُ مَا بِهِمْ مِنْ نِعْمَةٍ دَلِيلُهُمْ عَلَيْكَ لَوْ عَرَفُوكَ. The dalil, the evidence of your existence is not that we have to see your form, but rather the favors that you shower upon your servants is the evidence of your existence if they only knew you. You see the beauty, the way in which Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, he brings them back to Tawheed. And that's why when you look at Sahifa Sajjadiyya is Imam's lessons for us on Tawheed. It's Imam's lessons for us on the mercy of Allah, the justice of Allah, on Ma'ad. So one important theme that we see in the supplications of Imam Sajjad is a Quran-centric monotheism, a Quranic-based monotheism, a monotheism that was taught by the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. A second salient theme that we see in the supplications of Imam Sajjad alayhi salam is his frequent mention of salawat upon Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. If you collect the supplications of all of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt and you compare them to the supplications of Imam Sajjad, you will find there is usually going to be more salawat found in the ad'i of Imam Sajjad. Why? This is not arbitrary. This is not a mistake. This is by intentional design by Imam Sajjad. Why? To understand why there is so much emphasis on salawat in the ad'i of Imam Sajjad, you have to have some historical context. Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, one of the things that he does, he implements a policy that all of the speakers throughout the Islamic empire have to follow. And that is the la'na of Ahlul Bayt from the pulpits. Imagine, just as we begin the khutbah with tahmeed, Alhamdulillah alladhi khalaqa al-azwaj kullaha, the beginning of the khutbah. This is standard to recite tahmeed in khutbah al-Jumu'ah, for example. Under the reign of Muawiyah and the Umayyads, just as it is standard to praise Allah, it was standard to curse Aba Turab, which is Ali ibn Abi Talib, the family of the Prophet. So Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, what does he do? to counter the la'na of Ahlul Bayt on the pulpits, he emphasizes salawat upon Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad in his ad'iyah. He's teaching people that you are trying to seek nearness to Allah by asking Allah to deprive His rahmah from Ahlul Bayt. The Imam says you have it entirely the opposite. The only way for you to attain nearness to Allah is to send salawat upon Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. So Imam is, what is he trying to do? He's trying to re-establish the integral role of Ahlul Bayt in the spiritual development of the Muslim. This is why there's this emphasis on salawat. In fact, we have a very beautiful tradition that's attributed to Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi alayhi. Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, he says, إِذَا كَانَتْ لَكَ إِلَى اللَّهِ حَاجَةٌ. The Imam says, if you have a dire request that you want to present to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَابْدَأْ بِمَسْأَلَةِ الصَّلَاةِ عَلَى رَسُولِهِ. Begin your dua with salawat upon the Prophet and his family. ثُمَّ سَلْ حَاجَتَكَ. And then ask your haja. Why? Why does the Imam say mention salawat? He says, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ أَكْرَمُ مِنْ أَنْ يُسْأَلَ حَاجَتَيْنِ فَيَقْضِي إِحْدَاهُمَا وَيَمْنَعُ الْأُخْرَى. Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, he says, if you have a haja, don't just ask Allah for your haja. Begin by asking Allah to send salutations upon the Prophet and his family, because that's a dua. That's also a haja. You're making a request to Allah. And then ask your haja. Why? Because Allah is too generous to accept one dua and to reject another. So if you have a haja, ask Allah to elevate Ahlul Bayt, and Allah, this is a dua that surely will be answered by Allah. And then include your dua, and Allah is Kareem. He's not going to accept the dua of salawat and reject your haja. One of the great mafatih that we have as followers of Ahlul Bayt is just because of our love and devotion for Ahlul Bayt, Allah grants us many things that we're not deserving of. But because of their honor, because of the glory of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showers us with His mercy. The third theme that we find in the supplications of Ali ibn al-Husayn alayhi salam is that during the time of Imam Sajjad, the Islamic empire is expanding. A lot of wealth is being introduced into Muslim societies. And therefore you have the temptation of materialism. Hubbud dunya is a problem. And just to give you a sense of how much people had deviated during the time of Imam Sajjad, there was a woman in Medina who was a singer by profession. She was a singer who lived in Medina. As you know, just because you live in Medina doesn't mean that you're going to be religious. If you don't believe me, go now to Mecca and Medina and you'll meet some very interesting characters. In Medina, during the era of Imam Sajjad, there was a woman who was a very talented singer. She was so talented that the Khalifa in Sham wanted to hire her to be an official entertainer in his palace. So now this is a huge career opportunity for her. Major upgrade. I get to work in the palace and sing for Khalifatul Muslimin. So now she decides she wants to take this opportunity. She wants to leave and travel from Medina and relocate in Sham. Very good pay, very good benefits, right? So now she's preparing to leave Medina. Would you believe the historical accounts say many of the people of Medina came out to farewell her and they were crying that she was leaving. Imagine. This is Madinat Rasulullah. This is the city of the Prophet. In a span of a half a century, the same community who was crying over the death of the Prophet is now crying that they are losing a singer. You don't think this happens today? This happens also today. He comes to the majlis of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, and he'll go to a concert and cry. Tears of joy. This was the spiritual condition of the community. They were suffering of hubbud dunya. They lost sight of their priorities. And this is where you see Imam Sajjad in his du'as, he has potent reminders about death. He has reminders of the akhirah. For example, if you look at Munajatul Murideen, the whispered prayers of those who are desirous, who seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Look at what Imam says. He says, Subhanaka, glory be to you. Ma adyaqa at-turuqa ala man lam takun dalilu. Glory be to you, O Allah. How narrow are the paths of the ones who have not taken you as their guide. If you go through life without Allah, Allah leaves you to yourself. And Imam is saying that if you live a life without Allah, life becomes very narrow, becomes very dark. If you make dunya your best friend and your ultimate pursuit, Imam is saying that you're going down a very narrow, miserable path. But if you live a life with Allah, you live a life with God, a God-centric life, you see that life is very beautiful. It's open. Allah expands your heart. In another dua, in dua Abi Hamza al-Thumali, what does Imam Sajjad say? He says, Sayyidi, akhrij hubb ad-dunya min qalbi. O my master, remove the love of this material world from my heart. The Imam is speaking about hubb ad-dunya as a disease. You should ask Allah not to make you obsessed and attached. Imam is communicating the virtue of zuhud to Medinan society. He's communicating the virtue of zuhud in Mecca. He's teaching people about detaching from this life because death is easier upon the one who doesn't form these unhealthy attachments. In dua Abi Hamza al-Thumali, look at this beautiful line of the Imam. He teaches us how to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for Jannah and how to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from fire in a very beautiful, creative way. Look at what the Imam says. He says, Ilahi, in adkhaltani an-nar, ففي ذلك سرور عدوك. Believe me, only Ahlul Bayt can speak like this to Allah. Imam Sajjad says, Oh my Lord, if you send me to the hellfire, this will cause your enemy to rejoice. Who is going to be happy if I go to Jahannam? Iblis. وَإِنْ أَدْخَلْتَنِ الْجَنَّةِ فَفِي ذَلِكَ سُرُورُ نَبِيِّكَ. But if you send me to Jannah, this will make Rasulullah happy. وَأَنَا أَعْلَمُ وَاللَّهِ, and I know, O Allah, that what? أَنَّ سُرُورَ نَبِيِّكَ أَحَبُّ إِلَيْكَ مِنْ سُرُورِ عَدُوِّكَ. And O Allah, I know that the happiness of your Prophet is more beloved to you than the happiness of your enemy. You and I, we say, Oh Allah, please help, grant me Jannah. But look at the way that Imam teaches you how to ask for Jannah. To ingrain within us that we all need the shafa'ah and the wasila of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa to get to paradise. The fourth major theme that we see in the supplications of Imam Sajjad alayhi salam is that the Imam, he teaches us akhlaq. One of the best supplications that you will read on what Islam says about moral virtues is dua makarim al-akhlaq. It's a masterpiece of what Ahlul Bayt envision for their community. To be people of righteousness, to be people of virtue. One example from this dua is the Imam says, وَلَا تَرْفَعْنِي دَرَجَةً فِي النَّاسِ إِلَّا حَطَتْتَنِي عِنْدَ نَفْسِي مِثْلَهَا. Oh Allah, do not elevate me in the eyes of the people unless you degrade me within myself in equal proportion. Meaning, as with every degree that you make me honorable in the eyes of people and you elevate me, downgrade me in myself so I remain humble. Medina was a place of ulama. Medina is a place of narrators of hadith and scholars. Imam Sajjad is teaching everyone that no matter how high you go in knowledge, do not ever forget the virtue of tawadu. Don't forget the virtue of humility. Be humble. Do not be arrogant. Do not allow your knowledge to be a hijab that blinds you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A fifth theme that we see in the supplications of Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam is that the Imam redefines the meaning of what it means to be an Imam and a Khalifa. During the time of Imam Zainul Abidin, many Muslims were simpletons. They were ignorant. In their minds, Imam is just someone who leads Salah, right? Just like the governor in Medina. Khalifa is the de facto political leader. In the supplications of Imam Sajjad, he redefines the meaning, the true meaning of an Imam and the true meaning of a Khalifa. So for example, we have in the supplication, Imam alayhi salam, he says, Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa alih. Oh Allah, send salutations upon Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. La sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Oh Allah, send salutations upon Muhammad and his household. Now the question that naturally arises, who is the household of Muhammad? There are some sects within Islam that will extend Ahlul Bayt to include the cousins, the children of Aqil, all of the extended relatives. Imam narrows down the definition. In the next sentence he says, أَطَايِبِ أَهْلِ بَيْتِهِ. They are not all of the relatives and the members of his household. They are the righteous, the goodly ones from his family. And then he says what? Who are these righteous ones from the family who are the Ahlul Bayt? He says, الَّذِينَ اخْتَرْتَهُمْ لِأَمْرِكَ. The family of the Prophet, they're not his relatives. They are those individuals whom Allah chose for his affair. And then he says what? What does it mean to be chosen by Allah? The next line, the Imam mentions one of the implications of divine designation. وَجَعَلْتَهُمْ خَزَنَةَ عِلْمِكَ. The ones who you chose, they are the trustees of your knowledge. The Imam is trying to say that the Imam, Ahlul Bayt, these are not just any individuals. These are the ones who are carrying divine knowledge with them. And then he says, وَحَفَظَةِ دِينِكَ. Ahlul Bayt, the real Ahlul Bayt. Because you have the Umayyads and the Abbasids, they were all claiming that we're the family of the Prophet, right? We're related to the Prophet's uncles. We're Ahlul Bayt. Imam says, no, Ahlul Bayt are those who Allah chose. Ahlul Bayt are the trustees of Allah's knowledge. Ahlul Bayt are the protectors of His religion. Imam Sajjad, he's saying the real Imam is the one who is the protector of God's religion. I ask you, if someone is running away in the battlefield, can you call him a protector of Allah's deen? When a person runs away in the battlefield, and we know that some of the companions of the Prophet, they fled. If a person is running away in battle, that means what? They gave more priority to saving themselves than saving Islam. Imam is saying what? He's saying the true Imam is the one who prioritizes the protection of Islam. وَحَفَظَةَ دِينِكَ وَخُلَفَاءَكَ فِي أَرْضِكَ. The real Khalifa is not just any random person that you give bay'ah to. Imam is saying the real Khalifa is Khalifatullah. It's the vicegerent of God upon earth. Someone who represents Allah, not someone who represents a clan or a tribe. And then he says, وَطَهَّرْتَهُمْ مِنَ الرِّجْسِ وَالدَّنَسِ تَطْهِيرًا بِإِرَادَتِكَ. This is a reference to Ayatul Tathir, that these are the Ahlul Bayt. وَجَعَلْتَهُمُ الْوَسِيلَةَ إِلَيْكَ. And you made them, Ahlul Bayt, the means through which the servants can reach you. And then he says what? وَالْمَسْلَكَ إِلَى جَنَّتِكَ. And they are the pathways that lead to your paradise. These are the supplications of Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam. So when you go to these supplications, we have to understand that these are not random, arbitrary du'as. This was Imam's plan to reform the ummah after the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein. And some of the social and the spiritual ills that were experienced at that time, today we suffer from them. Sahifa Sajjadiyya was a prescription for his time, but it's also a prescription for our time. Because the people during the time of Imam Sajjad, they suffered of hubbud dunya. And today we also grapple and we struggle with hubbud dunya. The du'as of Imam Sajjad, my dear brothers and sisters, I really believe that it is one of the neglected treasures of Al Muhammad. There are 54 du'as that have been preserved in Sahifa Sajjadiyya. And Sahifa Sajjadiyya does not represent the totality of Imam Sajjad's supplications. But I think as families throughout the year, if you don't have time to pray together or eat together, at least in the evenings, open up Sahifa Sajjadiyya and read one dua as a family. Believe me, my dear brothers and sisters, this is the best investment for your marriages and your families. This will bring so much barakah to your household. Exposing yourself to the light of Imam Zaynul Abidin alayhi salam. Imam did not leave us to ourselves. The Imam gave us this rich legacy. But unfortunately, as with all of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, they were not appreciated. Imam Zaynul Abidin alayhi salam, he lived for 34 years. And what he accomplished was incredible, given the circumstances that he faced. The Imam left this world at the age of 57, which is a very short life. And the narrations say, like many of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, Imam Zaynul Abidin alayhi salam was poisoned. Some say by Al-Walid ibn Abdul Malik, others say by Hisham ibn Abdul Malik. But isn't it sad, my dear brothers and sisters, that it's not the non-Muslims who are killing Al-Muhammad. It's the ones who claim to love their grandfather. And that's why Imam Sajjad, in a very painful statement, he says to the Muslims that I swear by God, if Rasulullah had commanded the Muslims to massacre and oppress Ahlul Bayt, they could have not oppressed us more than they did. It's as though the Muslims are acting as though the Prophet told them to abuse Ahlul Bayt. But what did the Prophet say with regards to his Ahlul Bayt? He says, as the Quran says, قُلْ لَا أَسْأَلُكُمْ عَلَيْهِ أَجْرًا إِلَّا الْمَوَدَّةَ فِي الْقُرْبَى. The Prophet did not want anything. He did not want any compensation from the Muslims. The only thing that he wanted was our hidayah, our guidance. But the only way to be rightly guided, to tread as-sirat al-mustaqim, is to take your Islam from Ali ibn Abi Talib. Because all Muslims want the sunnah of the Prophet. But the question is, who will give you the complete, who is reliable, who is learned, who can actually give you an accurate picture of the sunnah of the Prophet? We say it's Ali ibn Abi Talib. We say it's Hassan al-Mujtaba. We say it's Fatimah al-Zahra. We say it's the Imam al-Hussein. And we say it's Imam Zain al-Abidin. But this Imam, he was administered poison. The traditions say that he did not survive very long after he consumed this poison. He was on his deathbed. And you can imagine how painful it was for Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam to be beside the bed of his father. Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam also witnessed the atrocities of Karbala. He saw what happened to his grandfather, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, and he saw all of those years of difficulty. He saw the hardships of his father. He saw how much Imam Zain al-Abidin wept and wailed over the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. The narrations say that when Imam Sajjad departed this world, Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, he was washing his body with some members of Bani Hashim. And they asked Imam al-Baqir, as they were looking at the body of Imam Zain al-Abidin, they saw some marks on the shoulder of Imam Sajjad. So they asked Imam al-Baqir, Ya ibn Rasulillah, ma hadhihi al-athar? What are these marks on the shoulder of your father? Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, what does he say? من حمل الطعام في الليل يدور به على منازل الفقراء. Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, he says that my father used to do something in the middle of the night that no one knew about. My father, Ali ibn al-Hussein, every night he would carry heavy bags of food and he would distribute it to the fuqara of Medina. And my father was a man of slim build. And over the years, those heavy sacks of food, they bruised the shoulder of Imam Zain al-Abidin. But they also asked Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, Ya ibn Rasulillah, in addition to the marks on his shoulder, we see that there are scars around the neck and the wrists and the feet of your father. What are these marks from? What are these wounds from? Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, he shares with them that these are the scars from the shackles that were put on Imam Sajjad after Karbala. Ali ibn al-Hussein was taken as a captive. Do you know how long these shackles were on the body of Imam Sajjad? Some reports say that for 40 days the collar and the shackles were around Imam Sajjad. One narration says that one of the companions of the Prophet, he saw Imam Zain al-Abidin in Sham. He was on his way to Baytul Maqdis. He was crossing through Sham and he saw the heads of the shuhada of Karbala. Sahal ibn Sa'ad al-Sa'idi, a companion of Rasulullah, he sees the caravan of the women and the children in Sham. He says, I saw among them a man standing among the women and the children. He says, I recognized that that young man was Ali ibn al-Husayn. He says, I went to Imam Sajjad and I greeted the Imam, Assalamu alayka ya ibn Rasulillah, hal laka min haja. I said to the Imam, ya ibn Rasulillah, is there anything that I can do for you at this moment? Sa'al ibn Sa'ad says that the Imam asked me a question that puzzled me. He asked me, Ya Sa'al, hal indaka thawbun atiq? Oh Sa'al, do you have an old rag to give me? I said to him, Ya ibn Rasulillah, you come from a family that only gives new clothes to people, and you're asking me for an old rag. What do you want to do with this rag? The Imam alayhi salam, he says, لأضع تحت الجامعة فإنها أكلت عنقي. The Imam, he says to him that I want you to give me a rag so I can put the rag between the shackles around my neck, because the shackles around my neck are eating away at my skin. Sa'al, he says, I went and fetched an old rag and I gave it to Imam Sajjad. I then looked at Imam Sajjad. He took the rag, he lifted the shackle around his neck, and he said, I swear by Allah that I saw blood pour down the neck of Imam Sajjad. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-ali al-azim. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal to accept these tears that we shed for Imam Zain al-Abidin. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal to give us the tawfiq to go to the holy city of Medina and pay our respects to our Mawla Ali ibn al-Hussein, Sayyid al-Sajidin. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal to make us of those who recite his Sahifa in our homes. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal to make us of those who uphold the teachings that he left for us in Risalatul Huquq. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal above all to include us, despite our shortcomings and our transgressions and our sins, to make us of those who receive the intercession of Imam Zain al-Abidin on the Day of Judgment. يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين. صلى على محمد